Should I send it to you again?
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is May 12th, Saturday. I'm Marcia Bowen with the LaRouche Political Action Committee, and very happy that I can help introduce Joel DeJean, who really needs no introduction, but and he will be presenting a very exciting discussion on fusion energy, which really encompasses the fourth economic law of LaRouche's 4 laws. And I am very happy to announce we have received our latest pamphlet. 20 boxes of these pamphlets are now here in the office here in Houston and in offices around the country. This has been a pamphlet we had rewritten to be current to the immediate moment we're living in. And I really think that as people go through this pamphlet, and we will probably have several classes to discuss the contents of this pamphlet. Interestingly, of course, today will be on the 4th law, which is a very important part of the pamphlet. And frankly, you know, in discussing LaRouche's economics, you really can't discuss LaRouche's economics unless you start from the top down. And this is the question you don't find in the textbooks in schools. You can't find these kind of ideas that LaRouche has brought forward in usually most textbooks. I'll say it that way. I'd be surprised to find any textbooks, at least in the American universities. But these ideas, if you think about it, are not only what is impelling what's happening with China leading the new Silk Road, and with the influence of Helga Zepp LaRouche, who's known as the Silk Road Lady in China, and the ideas in Russia, for example, where Lyndon LaRouche has been a very important part of the thinking of the intelligentsia of Russia, including LaRouche going into Russia shortly after he was released from prison at the invitation of Sergei Glaziev, who was a leading economist for President Putin, although there's problems, certainly, in these countries on economics, but the driving principle, the new spirit that is emerging on the planet is something that Lyndon and Helga Zepp LaRouche have been fighting for decades. And you could say this is how the future defines the present. And that's the way Mr. LaRouche, Helga Zepp LaRouche, and all of us to our best of our ability, you know, drive this process, which for most people would seem absolutely impossible to achieve. And that is a process to end geopolitical, the whole British Empire system on this planet for once and forever. And I want to point out that in the beginning of this pamphlet, it opens with a reminder of a speech that Lyndon LaRouche delivered on September 20th, 2012. That was in celebration of his 90th birthday, in which I'll read this paragraph, he discussed the impending end of partisan party politics in the United States and the challenge that this posed to the individual citizen, that is to you, to take leadership. This dynamic would soon manifest itself to the absolute confoundment and amazement of most in the 2016 election of US President Donald Trump, who had made himself the sworn enemy of both parties' elites. And as LaRouche identified then, there was a dying paradigm, that is this Wall Street, London economic paradigm, which is dying as we speak, versus this emergence of the new paradigm of the new Silk Road. And the election of President Trump was part of a global awakening that is still underway. And I point out, for example, today, the election of President Mahathir of Malaysia, 92 years old, friend of Lyndon LaRouche, friend of Michael Billington, his past deceased wife, Gail Billington. Mahathir is an example of somebody who was just elected because there is a revolt in Malaysia against the total corruption that is taken over. He's somebody who in the early 1980s through the 1990s worked very closely with us against the International Monetary Fund, against the George Soros usury policies. And one of the headlines about his re-election of a 92-year-old, think about it. Lyndon LaRouche himself is almost 96, so don't tell me you're too old to be a revolutionary. Forbes magazine had a headline, "Why Malaysia's surprise election result should be a wake-up call for global leaders." And it correctly notes that, and this was written by a Malaysian author, quote, "The backlash against entrenched elites is not confined to Malaysia. It is a force of nature that will continue to shape corporate diplomacy, business execution, and public policy throughout Asia and beyond. Another national election has produced yet another unexpected outcome: the convergence of fundamental forces that are sweeping the world, a middle-class backlash against entrenched and corrupt elites, and, like it or not, the growing influence of China." Now, I think that does express what happened with the election, not only of Mahathir, but of President Trump, of the other votes that have been very significant in, such as the Brexit vote, and what is a worldwide mass strike, a surge, an awakening in the spirit of people that they don't have to tolerate conditions that are oppressing them and destroying their future. And I think that's why the emergence of putting this pamphlet out now, after what we've done with our pamphlet on Robert Mueller, an amoral legal assassin, he'll do his job if you let him. Our intention is to accomplish, as we are now in the takedown of this Mueller witch hunt against President Trump, to then bring into the vacuum, if you will, the solutions to the crisis as LaRouche has so uniquely put them forward. And Joel will be going through that in a bit. I wanted to also point out, you have probably handed out now in the audience here a lead from our daily alert of May 10th, because really we're at a point now where these two paradigms, the geopolitical British Empire system, which is dying but can take everything down with it, versus the nation-building American system LaRouche approach. And as we wrote in the lead, after President Trump had just announced the withdrawal of the United States from the JCPOA, that is the agreement on Iran, which has caused quite a bit of upset, and it's still not clear where all that is going to lead. But if you think about it this way, look at what has happened in North and South Korea. Look at what is absolutely unprecedented in developments of these two countries coming together, and a solution on this question of perhaps ending the threat of nuclear war from at least that area of the globe has been brought together by the unique partnership of President Trump, of President Xi Jinping of China, of President Putin of Russia, President Abe of Japan, and others. Now, this approach, were this to be adopted on the Middle East question, would actually provide a far better solution than what was embodied in this agreement that was drawn up through the Obama administration, people like John Kerry. But that's the question. As Mrs. Helga Zepp LaRouche warns, that you have to look at the question of the Middle East from the standpoint, this is one of the, as Brian went through last week, the playground of the British Empire, where they can so easily set by difference of religions and other conflicts, destructive wars. Look what they've done in Iraq, in Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan. So only if you take the approach of the New Silk Road and LaRouche's 4 economic laws and ending this coup against President Trump, can you have a world in which what was accomplished in the South Korean crisis, which, by the way, involves a very phenomenal aspect, if you think about it. Not only did President Moon Jae-in of South Korea meet with President Kim Jong-un, together across each other's borders, and that was really unprecedented. But at a certain point in their meetings, the president of South Korea handed to the president of North Korea a thumb drive. And on that thumb drive is an array of economic projects for the development of the entire peninsula, one of which is the Tumen River area. And if you look at a map, that's a river that crosses across North Korea, Russia, China. So this has been something actually projected to be done since the 1990s. And I'll tell you, we've played a very major role in the question of not only that development project, but the railroads, major rail development, which is very exciting to link up the two nations as a one. Again, in the 1990s, we were in the middle of that. Lynn and LaRouche and others that were there involved in that. As I understand, their railroads there today go about 24 miles an hour. I mean, I'm not sure our railroads go much faster in many areas, so maybe we should take note. And also the question of electricity, which is a very dire need in North Korea. All of this is being addressed by plans for economic development that are probably, in a certain sense, more revolutionary than just simply ending the question of nuclear weapons. And by the way, it has been announced, there's a date that's been set, which is really extraordinary, which is May 22nd. I'm sorry, it will be, it's in May.
June 12th.
June 12th is when President Trump meets with President Kim Jong-un. But there's a date in May, not far away. It is the 22nd, which the North Koreans will actually invite observers to look at the destruction of the nuclear launch site or sites in North Korea. So think about that. I mean, how fast is this moving? So this is how mass strikes move. This is how periods like this, where you can't actually project what's going to happen next, except that you put yourself in the future, you drive a process to create the right outcome. And I think, as Mrs. LaRouche, who in January of this year insisted in one of her first broadcasts for the Schiller Institute webcast, insisted we have to make the year 2018 the year to end geopolitics. And here we are, May 12th, and a great deal of that is already clearly defined how that could be done. And I think she's also very insistent, if this process is going to be successful, we have to have the ability of President Trump to meet with President Putin of Russia. And again, this is why our pamphlet on taking down this Mueller apparatus is so important. I just want to give you a couple of updates on that front for those who, I mean, the news media is so unserving of truth. I think it's good for people to know. There's been a number of defeats of the Mueller team. I would go back to around May 5th or so. A judge in Alexandria, now let me remind you, a special prosecutor also went after Lyndon LaRouche in the 1980s. And that was led by Robert Mueller's team out of the Boston District Attorney's Office. And LaRouche warned at the time, if they can get away with this against me, they can get away with this against anyone. So just think about how we're beginning to roll back this Mueller structure and the British directed apparatus that's been going after President Trump. On May 5th, a judge, I'm sorry, I want to go back to May 3rd, Judge Ellis ruled that in the case of Paul Manafort, that he wants to see the actual documents that have given Robert Mueller the ability to do what he's done so far as a special prosecutor. As was pointed out by a constitutional law expert, Alan Dershowitz, they've been treating President Trump like a mafia boss. They're trying to squeeze him. They're threatening his underlings. They want the underlings to sing and then compose. They don't care about the truth about Paul Manafort and supposed bank fraud that goes back to 2005. What does that have to do with President Trump and the Russians' collusion in our elections? It has no relevance whatsoever, but that doesn't matter. As we know, these special prosecutors run fishing expeditions. But a judge wants to see the documents. He's blowing the whistle on this practice. It's going to take more than that, but that's an interesting development on the Manafort case. There's also 2 days later, an Alexandria judge accused Mueller's team of using unfettered power in this process, where you might remember that Mueller indicted 13 Russian citizens and 3 Russian companies for allegedly interfering in the US election. Now, Mueller didn't expect that the Russians would actually do something about this, but one of the Russian firms called Concord Management and Consulting has hired lawyers in the United States. They've answered the charge, and now they're demanding significant discovery. And when Mueller's team found out, oh my God, you mean the Russians are actually going to fight us? They asked for a delay in the trial, and the judge said, "Forget it, no way." So that should be very interesting. May 7th, just a couple days later, you might remember the name Eric Schneiderman. Now, this is Attorney General Schneiderman of New York State, who, after his election, he transformed his office into a Get Trump apparatus, war room. And he was brought into Mueller's operation directly. One of Schneiderman's prosecutors joined the Mueller team. And the New York Daily News at the time, which was very pro-Obama, wrote that because Schneiderman has jurisdiction over Trump's home state where he lived and managed his company and his campaign, that puts him way above Trump's presidential powers. Well, you might have heard Schneiderman has just been forced out based on accusations from 4 different women that he was an abusive, violent person. I won't say much more than that, but he's out. And I think that what we're seeing is there's a fight emerging around Trump, not just around Trump, it's around what we've done on this question of taking on the enemy. And what is this enemy? Well, there's another very interesting development on Thursday. Congressman Devin Nunes and Congressman Trey Gowdy were able to go into the Department of Justice and to look at some documents that had otherwise been redacted so heavily they couldn't read much in it. But what they found is very telling and reveals what we believe is one of the central questions of the whole, what instigated the assault against President Trump. And that involves the likelihood of an American citizen who was planted by the FBI into the Trump campaign. And I'll tell you, the name we believe is Stephen Halper. He is a so-called professor at Cambridge who apparently was used by the FBI to try to entrap both Papadopoulos and Carter Page. But this name has been redacted, and the question is, of course, as more and more comes out on this, and the writer of the Wall Street Journal article on this, she suggests that what needs to be done is that all documents relating to this investigation have to be made public. Everything has to be declassified, throw it all out in the open, because what has been done against this president, if you think it's bad enough that they were spying on a president using a FISA court order based on allegations from a British spy, what does it tell you that the FBI planted somebody in the Trump campaign who himself is directly tied to Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, very tied to Christopher Steele. Sir Richard Dearlove, who himself wrote a lot of the propaganda that was used in the lies that led up to the war in Iraq. The 10 Downing Street material. He himself tied into the circles of GCHQ head Robert Hannigan, GCHQ, General Communications Headquarters. Hannigan, it is known, and this is even published in the London Guardian, that he came over in summer of 2016 and met with John Brennan to tell the CIA, to tell the US intelligence agencies, this guy Trump, he's close to the Russians. You guys have got to investigate him. So we are now coming to a point where the role of the British directly, which is so uniquely what Lynn and LaRouche and our movement have identified, nobody else would go after the enemy the way we have. And as I said earlier, it's not just simply about bringing down Mueller. It's bringing down a British imperial system. And if you do that, then you can ensure that as this new Silk Road process grows, that this cannot be killed. That what we're in the process of ensuring is the emergence of the powers on this planet to revive the rebuilding of the nation state. And I'll just close with my recommendation that everybody should subscribe to our EIR magazine. This is the latest issue. And by the way, we now have this magazine available such that for only $60 for 2 months, by the way, you can get it on your phone, open it up in the email, and read it in a beautiful format. Very easy to read, color pictures on your phone. It's $360 a year. I highly recommend this journal.
It has articles by Keisha.
And I was just about, thank you, Craig, to point out that Keisha Rogers, who has just arrived after a campaign event, has a very important article in here this week, Why and How Humanity Must Return to the Moon, which also involves Keisha's work as those who know her, has been a champion of the space program since really she came into this movement and as she became a candidate of several campaigns. And she also had the opportunity for this article to interview Robert Thompson, who is former top official in the shuttle space program in various aspects. She can talk about it further if she'd like. Apparently this article is getting quite a bit of leg coverage. A lot of people are getting this out into the space networks because frankly, outside of what we're doing, as Barbara says in the introduction of this pamphlet, there's a demoralization that's set into the population. There's a tremendous propaganda against President Trump, a tremendous propaganda against what he got elected to do, to stop these regime change wars, to launch an industrial revival. He's been trapped into a situation where it's up to you, all of us, that we have to put our efforts right now to finish the job as we've launched this Mueller investigation to take down the whole British Empire structure. And for those who haven't read this pamphlet, we have copies here. You can get it online. And see us if you'd like to subscribe to EIR magazine. We'd be happy to help you with that. And I'm now going to turn the floor over to Joel DeJean so that he can give a discussion on the fourth law of Lynn and LaRouche. And Keisha, do you want to? Well, okay. Oh, yes. And I have the pamphlet up for Joel.
Okay. Do you have something immediately on your phone?
No, I can do it. This my phone?
Yeah.
Thank you, Marcia.
Hold on 1 second, Joe.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Just a
I got it. Go ahead, Joel.
Well, thank you, Marcia, and thank you for those chocolate chips. Key component of the new paradigm. And by the way, you know what Schneiderman said on his way out the door?
Uh-oh.
Me too.
Uh-oh. Yeah, there you go.
Now, a few weeks ago, I received an early morning email from Brian Lance. I'm talking about 6 a.m. And I happened to be up at the time, and I looked at the subject line, and it said that Lockheed Martin awarded patent for compact fusion reactor design that can power a fighter jet. And having worked in designing electrical and electronics for various jet aircraft, fighter jets in the 80s, I remember the space and weight requirements, and my initial reaction was, and this was on April 1st, my initial reaction was, this has got to be an April Fool's joke. Upon further investigation, I was able to get a copy of the patent, and I was unable to read it. My reader was unable, my screen reader was unable to read it, and I had to get Ben Denniston to run it through his optical character reader, and was able to read the file. And upon further investigation, this could be a real breakthrough. Now, I had heard about the Lockheed work on a compact fusion reactor last year, but this provides more detail. Now, before I go through the specifics, I want you to hear from the horse's mouth. The lead design engineer at Lockheed, who is the head of what's called the Skunk Works, has a 4-minute video introducing this compact fusion reactor. So I want you to hear that. And those of you on the internet, if it doesn't come through, I'll provide a link to this video in the description page of the broadcast. So, Glenda? You hear that?
If the air is mineral, it works.
old do you think this guy is? By the way, I don't know if he mentioned it. His name is Thomas McGuire, MIT graduate.
30, I was gonna say. I don't know.
He's in his early 30s.
Yeah.
So he graduated from MIT maybe 7 years ago. And he now heads the skunk works of Lockheed Martin.
Wow.
Now, there's a whole history to the skunk works, and maybe if you have questions, I'll go through that later, or Evelyn can fill you in.
Sounds smelly.
It is, but Lockheed Martin, as you may know, is the largest U.S. defense contractor. And just to give you an idea, the contracts that they are awarded annually, and it fluctuates, is 3 times larger than the entire defense budget of Iran. In the billions, tens of billions. Lockheed is headed up, by the way, by a woman named Marilyn Houston. And this guy McGuire meets with her and her team at least once every 2 months to give her updates on these developments. But just to fill out the picture, were there many figures and views of the reactor in the video?
A few.
You can tell.
Not too. Just.
All right. Well, let's put up the first figure.
We have the handout.
Everybody's got the handout, Joe.
Yeah, but this is
That's
for
the first thing
the
in front of you.
internet. Not everybody on the internet has a handout.
That's true.
Now, this shows you the reactor, and it's a different design than the one that I went through last year from Princeton Satellite Systems. It uses deuterium and tritium instead of helium-3. Now, does it show the dimensions? Does it show the components?
It shows components, like heat injectors and the coil, and 2 internal coils.
Okay. Well, basically, it's a cylinder, and as he said in the video, you have to heat up the gas. Now, the gas is deuterium and tritium. You heat it to millions of degrees. Now, obviously, if you heat a gas to millions of degrees and it touches the side of the container will be vaporized. So the way you contain the plasma, which is the charge particles, is with a magnetic field. And in this particular design, it has a magnetic mirror on either side and coils along the circumference of the cylinder. Now, the dimensions, I don't know if the dimensions are clear, but as he says, the original design should be able to fit on a flatbed truck. Now, just to go through a little bit of what he went through on Fusion, I'm sure you all know this, but I'll just go through this review. That in fusion, as opposed to a chemical reaction where you exchange electrons to produce energy, in fusion, you are fusing lighter elements to make a heavier element. Now, in thermonuclear physics, you can explain it using basic arithmetic. And especially in fusion, you don't even need more than 10 figures. So just to go through this particular reaction, he's using deuterium, which you can obtain from seawater. And deuterium is an isotope of hydrogen where you have 1 proton and 1 neutron. So it's duo. Tritium is an isotope of hydrogen where you have 1 proton and 2 neutrons. So in the heat of the plasma, with the containment of the magnetic bottle, as he says, the elements can fuse. And when you fuse deuterium and tritium, so you get 2 plus 3. Now, it's not really basic arithmetic because in thermonuclear fusion, 2 plus 3 does not equal 5. It equals something like 4.95. So there's a little bit of, instead of ending up with 5, end up with less than 5. But there's a little bit of mass that is converted according to our old friend Albert Einstein's energy mass equivalence. That little bit of mass multiplied by the square of the speed of light gives you a tremendous release of energy. And as he says in the video, compared to a chemical reaction, a nuclear reaction releases over 1 million times more energy. Now, that's a big number, but just to give you an idea, in this design, they contain the reaction products with not only magnetic fields, but one of the reaction products is a high energy neutron. Because when you combine the deuterium with the tritium, you end up with a nucleus of a helium-4 or alpha particle, which has about 3.6 million electron volts of energy, and you end up with a low neutron, which goes away with 80% of the energy of the reaction, or 14 million electron volts. And that neutron, being a neutral particle, cannot be contained by the magnetic fields of the magnetic coils, the superconducting magnetic coils. But in this design, they're surrounded by a blanket of lithium. Now, does this figure show the lithium blanket? I don't know if
I think it does.
It shows where the plasma is around the 2 coils.
it should anything surrounding the cylinder.
Yeah, there is.
Okay, so there's a blanket of lithium. Now, anyone here probably has a little bit of lithium in your pocket. It's in your lithium battery. Now, to give you an idea of the difference between a chemical reaction and a nuclear reaction, in a typical day of heavy use, your cell phone's battery, which consists of lithium, cobalt, and other elements, but basically it's a lithium battery, exchanging electrons. The little bit of lithium in your battery, it's a few grams, you could probably power that cell phone for a day or 2 days. Let's say 1 day of heavy use. If that lithium in your battery, and by the way, the purpose of the blanket is not only to shield the aircraft or the ship or the building from the high energy neutrons, you could breed fuel, additional fuel from the lithium. Because I just want to go through this. A high energy neutron hitting a lithium-6. Now, lithium is the 3rd element on the periodic table of elements. You have hydrogen, helium, and then lithium. So lithium has 3 protons and 3 neutrons. So the basic lithium in your battery is lithium-6. If lithium-6 is hit by a high energy neutron, it becomes lithium-7 for a few microseconds, and then it splits to give you an alpha particle or a helium-4 nucleus and a tritium. So you can create tritium with this blanket so that feeding deuterium into the chamber, you create tritium so you can run this reactor for years at a time with just a few kilograms of deuterium. And the tritium will be generated by the blanket. So to give you an equivalence, the amount of grams in your battery, in your cell phone battery. Like I said, if you use it normally, it lasts for a day. You got to plug it in again. If you were to convert that lithium into a nuclear reaction, give you tritium, the same amount of lithium in your battery would give you power for 3,000 years. The same amount of lithium in your battery. Now, obviously, you're not going to be around for 3,000 years, and your descendants probably won't be using the same phone. But the idea is that the nuclear reaction gives you 1,000,000 times more energy for the same mass as a chemical reaction. And that goes for whether you're burning fuel, methane, oxygen, liquid oxygen, any chemical reaction, any battery, no matter how well designed, there's a limit to how much energy density you can get from a chemical reaction. So if we can go to the second figure.
Okay.
Now, does this go through the various uses?
So this is the one with the outer, the first one was the slice. This is the picture of the engine from the outside. Do you want me to go to the
They're
next
on a
one?
border.
Oh, okay.
No, no.
All right, well, let's go with what we got. So can you see the lithium plant? This one? Or you just see the coil?
No, you see the outer coils, and it just shows it standing on legs, and it just describes the same thing as the first one, which was the slice, the interior slice.
Okay.
So I can go to the next
Yeah, go
one,
to the
Tess.
next.
There we go. It's got the truck, the plane.
Okay, so the size, and by the way, they've been working on this for 5 years now, this particular design. They hope to have a prototype next year. Now, hopefully they can meet that requirement. But the size of this unit, if you can't see the dimensions, the initial prototype is 1 meter by 2 meters. So 1 meter wide, 2 meters long.
Wow.
The output, the thermal output of this reactor is something like 100 megawatts, which could power the equivalent of 80,000 homes. Now, in a Texas summer, there's probably 2,000 homes. But you could see it, and as McGuire went through, this type of reactor, if you can replace the heat generation from a thermal fan for a jet, you're basically sucking in air to get the oxygen, and you're spraying in a gas, a fuel, and that mixture is heated up, and the exhaust gives you your thrust. If you can replace that fuel with just the heat from a heat exchanger from the nuclear reactor, you can replace the fuel necessary to run a jet. But more importantly, you could replace all of the coal-fired plants, and he does fall into the prey of this climate change nonsense, but that's typical. But you could replace all coal-fired power plants, natural gas-fired power plants, and more importantly, what inspired McGuire, and he says in his various articles on this, when he was a student at MIT, he was inspired to look at using fusion reactors to power a mission to Mars.
Yeah.
Now, there's another connection with Mars here because Lockheed Martin, besides making fighter jets and hopefully mass producing compact fusion reactors, is a big contractor for space vehicles. It built the Juno spacecraft, which is now circling Jupiter. It also built the InSight Martian spacecraft, which is now on its way to Mars. And by the way, the InSight was launched last Saturday morning. It's on its way to Mars, and it's already received the boost of its chemical rocket, so it's coasting to Mars. Mars is the closest to Earth now, and in the coming months, it's closest to Earth in the last 15 years. So because of that closeness, the trip will only take 6.5 months. Now, if you could replace that chemical propulsion with a constant acceleration fusion powered, then you could cut that time to less than a month, or even a few days if we keep advancing the design. So this is something that's in the works, and unlike the design from the Princeton satellite group, which we have an interview with them that Megan Beats did while we were up there. And that design uses helium-3. This design uses deuterium, like I went through. But it shows that there are a lot of things in the works that are not well known or well advertised. And it shows that there are more than one way to skin a cat.
Oh.
I know that touches a raw. But this breakthrough, and again, they haven't developed the prototype yet. They haven't reached break even. But if you look at the comment section of that video of McGuire, about half the comments are just the typical cynical, well, we've been working on fusion for 60 years and it's 5 years away every time. It's 10 years away. Well, as Dennis Speed noted in the fireside chat on Thursday, think back to 1961. How, if you were to pose a question to the average citizen in January of 1961, after Kennedy's inauguration, but before his speech on a moon mission, and you were to pose a question to the citizen, well, how long would it take us to get to the moon? Well, in January of 1961, the time to get to the moon was infinite because we haven't even had the rockets to get to orbit, let alone to the moon. But because of the presidential leadership and the concentration of forces from NASA and the various defense companies and other electronic companies, we were able to build the hardware to get to the moon. So if you take that attitude with fusion, if we had a presidential directive that said we're going to take these designs, like and the one from Princeton, and we're going to collaborate with our friends in China and Russia to accelerate, and we're going to bring in the brilliant designers from North Korea who have been able to build a nuclear force on basically rice and kimchi.
Really?
And we bring in our friends from Iran who also have been able to build up a advanced defense sector, even though their economy is 1/50th the size of the U.S. economy. The defense budget is 1/50th the size of our defense budget. Their population is 1/4 of our population. But if we were to recruit these people, and some of these scientists and engineers are working on the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor in France, called the ITER. But that, as he mentions, as McGuire mentions in the video, that is a huge building which weighs about 23,000 tons. This design is about 2,000 tons. So if we continue the work on the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, continue the work in Princeton, continue the work at Lockheed and General Atomics, and concentrate our efforts with our international allies, we can achieve fusion in the next 5 to 10 years. That's what we can look at. And if we direct the financial resources that we've been throwing away and bailing out Wall Street into developing the highest technology, like what's being done at Lockheed, then we can actually crack this problem and actually achieve fusion in the coming decade. And that would be a mission that I'm sure most of our young people would be hungry to get a part of. So now they show the last figure. It was
The last figure is the one with the reactor, the fuel processor, and it's a head-on to an aircraft system.
okay. Yeah, this is what I was skeptical about. Well, you can put this on an aircraft, but he shows in his patent that it can be done. But more important than fueling a fighter jet would be fueling a spacecraft on its way to Mars. And once it got there, you would have the power necessary to run a village, a small village, on first the moon and then Mars. So this is what we should be working on. We've been working on this here and there, Lockheed, Princeton, certain plants in China's working on a design called the ETAR, or experimental thermonuclear superconductor thermonuclear advanced reactor. The South Koreans are working on a superconducting thermonuclear reactor. Obviously the French, now the Germans, they've given up on nuclear. I don't know why, but they need a lot of help there. And also the South Africans. Now, this week's Executive Intelligence Review, besides having Keisha's article on the interview with the NASA manager, also has an interview with the head of the South African nuclear program. And he goes through the whole idea of developing nuclear fission power for South Africa. And he also, at the end, the interviewer, David Cherry, asked him about fusion. And he goes through some of the highlights of fusion and what South Africa could contribute. So if you take this global picture and look at individual designs that we could be accelerating, this is what nuclear physicists, nuclear engineers around the world should be working on. And this is what our high school students and elementary school students should be looking at as what they can be involved in contributing for not only their future, but for the future of humanity as a whole, on this planet and off this planet.
Amen.
So I'll leave it at that. If you have any particular questions, I'll take them down. Oh, I forgot to mention that there's another design that's in California. I don't know if you can see it on here. The National Ignition Facility in Livermore, Lawrence, Livermore, has a facility with the most powerful laser in the world. Now, it's about the size of a football field. 192 lasers converging on a small pellet target, and that's laser fusion, inertial confinement fusion. So that's part of the mix. So I'll leave it at that.
So, in the video, he said the reason we were able to massively reduce the size is because of what he referred to as something, I think, beta factor, in terms of the magnetic, it has something to do with maximizing magnetic confinement.
It's the ratio, the beta, this is the ratio of the magnetic field strength to the plasma pressure. And the whole idea of achieving fusion, the reason why it's so difficult. The sun has it easy because it has a huge mass. 300,000 times the mass of the Earth is contained in the sun. And that gravitational mass at the very core provides a temperature of over 15 million degrees Celsius. And that temperature and pressure is enough to provide the fusion that has been powering the sun for 5 billion years. To recreate that on Earth, we've already done that. And one of the funny comments in the video was one guy said that, well, if we develop this fusion, we can turn it into a weapon. Well, maybe he's been asleep for the last 65 years, but we've had thermonuclear fusion since 1953 when we detonated the first thermonuclear bomb. So we know how to create fusion on Earth. We just haven't been able to control it. So the idea of having a smaller size is you can contain the plasma. You have less plasma, but with the superconducting magnet. And the superconductor is simply a wire where you reduce the temperature of the material to close to absolute zero, which eliminates any resistance. So the amount of energy you need for a strong magnetic field is reduced. And some of you have probably experienced a superconductor if you've ever had a MRI. I know Belinda's had dozens of these things. But you know that when you go in, you have to take off all the metal. Otherwise, your face gets sucked up into the magnet. But the idea is that if you have a high magnetic field, and it's measured, the magnetic field is measured in Teslas, not Elon Musk Teslas, but it's a magnet. It's 10,000 times the strength of Earth's magnetic field. So if you have a high magnetic field to plasma pressure ratio, then you're more efficient at containing the plasma so that the elements have a chance to fuse. And he's pretty confident that this will work. And Lockheed has not been known just to throw their money out the window. So hopefully they can accelerate it and get the prototype next year sometime.
Yeah.
How is the heat generated? So the high energy neutrons are the hottest thing, although they're neutrons.
Right.
And they're going into the lithium. So where does this heat exhaust to create the power and the thrust come from?
Now, it may be in figure 2.
Okay.
In the lithium, now the lithium shield, it's like 30 centimeters thick. And the lithium shield itself is 300 tons. It's heavier than your battery.
Yeah.
But what happens besides producing or breeding tritium, in the blanket, you have some heat exchangers. And what they're using is liquid metal, either a lithium fluoride or lithium beryllium, some metal that has a low temperature where it's liquid. And that not only provides the shielding, but that's where the heat is transferred from the neutrons to the blanket. And that heat exchanger is what takes the heat to either a turbofan or a steam turbine, or in future designs, I think of using magnetohydrodynamics. But the purpose of the blanket is to breed the tritium and to take the heat away and to shield the occupants of the whatever vehicle from the high energy neutrons. So I don't know which figure it was, but it shows that the blanket has these tubes where the liquid coolant, like the radiator, runs through the blanket. It takes the heat away from the blanket to whatever you're going to use the heat for.
Well, they have something labeled heat injectors.
Well, that's to start to turn the gas into a plasma. in the Princeton design, they use radio frequency to inject a radio frequency signal into the gas to heat the gas like your microwave oven almost. In this design, they also use a neutron beam injectors so that they shoot the beam into the gas and the gas absorbs the energy from the neutron beams and is heated into a plasma where the electrons and the ions are separated. So that's to start the reaction. And once you get the fusion going, and this has not yet been achieved, but once you get that fusion going, it provides the heat to keep the reaction going. Yeah.
Were you gonna say something else?
No,
Okay,
that's it.
can you speak more on the applications? You talked a little bit about it, and applications of why, going into LaRouche's fourth law in terms of what a fusion economy is, why this was applied to an economic process.
Yeah, if you hear McGuire at the end, he says that this is where the atomic age can begin. But you can imagine, even if you have the size of a flatbed truck, think of what could be done in Puerto Rico, for example. You can send shiploads of these generators to replace the diesel generators with fusion reactors. And you can localize the production of electricity to where it's needed. And obviously, if you can develop the energy with a few grams of deuterium and tritium for a whole island economy, you can do that for any nation in Africa. Then, with that type of reactor, obviously, besides the aircraft, fueling the aircraft, you can also provide the energy for a plasma reactor on a rocket to Mars, to Pluto, and you can provide the energy for your various spaces, either on the moon or Mars. So with this type of reactor, any limit to energy goes out the window. And it's not shown here, but if you have a heat generator that could create additional, like a plasma torch, you can put any material into the plasma torch, any waste product. Like you could put your iPhone into the plasma torch, and all the basic elements in that iPhone, the silicon, the lithium, cobalt, the rare earth metals would be separated, and using various magnetic fields, and you could distill various elements to various containers. Any idea of a shortage of rare earths or critical elements goes out the window. So again, once you have a energy producer that runs 24 hours a day, and this is what comes through in the article from our friend in South Africa. It says that the West, the Germans, are ready to sell us windmills and solar panels. And he just basically, well, what happens when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine?
Right.
You can't run high-speed electric trains on intermittent power.
Or a modern hospital.
Right, yeah, you can imagine you're under the knife and the power goes out. Now that happens all the time in third world nations. And it's gonna happen in the United States if we don't wake up.
I was gonna say, Joel, that, you just think in the United States, all these emergency situations around the world, whether it's through war situations or, talking about the situation still in Puerto Rico or in Haiti, where you don't have power, where you need power, and, a ship might come along and give them power for a certain amount of time. I mean, the application of this capacity is so enormous in terms of overturning or all kinds of critical failures, you know, in agriculture and other things like that because of a lack of fuel, a lack of ability to refrigerate.
Right. Now, you probably all heard about the lettuce, romaine lettuce here.
Yeah.
And I keep hearing about this. And, well, we have a solution already. It's called irradiation of food. But you need power to run the irradiation. And the radiation doesn't change the food, just kills whatever pathogens are on the food. So you could have irradiation units at the source or at the receiving end.
Yep.
So we can eliminate this hysteria around listeria and other.
Possibly with the radiation. When you go into the, I know every time I go into the clinic to get an examination, they said, put this vest on. So I said, no, I'm not at the childbearing age no more. I am going to school hospital. But, and they always make you put that vest on. So how's that going to affect the food with the radiation? Does that affect the?
Well, no, it's a short-term irradiation, but the food is
Extends the shelf life.
right. Well, what you have on lettuce is you have various E. coli. E. coli is a living organism that is very sensitive to gamma radiation. Now, the amount of radiation you receive from that X-ray is less than what you receive when you go on a cross-country air flight. So it's a precaution. But if you have irradiation for food, you eliminate the pathogens, but you don't leave the food in the radiation field long enough that it breaks down the fibers of the plant.
Oh,
It just attacks the E. coli.
Talk about strawberries. They would last. a long time.
Well, yeah, you could have chocolate strawberries for, I wouldn't say a lifetime, but you could extend the shelf life of chocolate strawberry.
who would approve that? That
Your
testing
radiation
with the
will
radiation?
extend the
Well,
life.
I didn't hit, what was the question?
Joel, I have a question and a comment. One is, the comment is, you know, if we have nuclear fusion like this, it's gonna revolutionize the materials industry. Because it makes, alchemy come alive. Right, because that means we will be able to control the structure of atoms in
Right.
various ways. And that is a totally exciting kind of complete transformation of economic activity. I mean, because that's, I mean, there's the possibilities are enormous. But anyway, then the question is, lithium, how is lithium a widely available element on the planet?
In the universe, lithium is the third most abundant element after hydrogen and helium.
How about,
Now, on the Earth's crust, it's the 35th most abundant element.
so that's pretty common.
It's common, but if you think about it, Tesla has a whole battery production plant in Reno, Las Vegas. And they're using lithium is usually a lithium salt. And there are lithium deposits all over the world, but it's concentrated in Chile, the easiest to obtain, and in China. So there's plenty of lithium to go around. But if you just think of the conversion of lithium to tritium, and that's alchemy right there. If you think about it, you're transmuting lithium to helium and tritium. And by the way, tritium it has a half-life of 12.2 years. And it decays through an emission of an beta decay from the nucleus. It decays to helium-3.
Huh.
So they had a program after the collapse of the Soviet Union called megatons to megawatts, where they would dismantle the warhead, take the tritium, and wait for it to decay into helium-3 for various experiments. And also to trigger the H-bomb, instead of magnetic fields and neutron beams and microwaves, it's triggered by an atom bomb of plutonium. So they would take the plutonium out and mix it into uranium and use that in fission reactors. So that's the ultimate swords into plowshares. So you're right, you can transmute it. Also, like I mentioned, with a plasma torch, if you were to dig up a cubic mile anywhere on Earth, that's big, cubic mile width, length, and height. Any cubic mile of Earth with the energy of a fusion torch to separate the elements. Now, normally the cubic mile has all the elements on the periodic table, but the concentration is so low that it's not a viable deposit. But if you can separate the elements with the plasma torch and using magnetic fields, harvest the various elements, that cubic mile could supply all the aluminum, all the iron, all the rare earth metals for the entire world economy, just from that cubic mile. So besides transmuting elements, you could actually harvest them from dirt.
For how long?
About a year. But again, we have all these planets that we can harvest.
Is there any more?
I don't know.
Oh, I was going to show. Can you show the? Is there a map of Africa at night?
Oh, yeah.
Is there what?
The page with Africa at night in the proposal.
Yeah, turn back one
Yeah.
page.
Okay. Now, if you ever seen this, does it show after electricity?
Yeah,
Yeah.
first,
And you've probably seen pictures of North and South Korea at night. And South Korea is like a Christmas tree. And North Korea has less than 1% of the electricity capacity as the South.
This
What
is the old,
page is that?
this is the old one.
This
This
is-
The old one.
this is page,
Underneath the
Was
bottom.
it
of the-
I'm sorry, I want to read the new ones.
um,
I'm
This is
sorry.
the one.
page 16.
Oh, in the lit room.
Right.
Down in the lit room?
She has.
It's okay. Let him,
But-
it's okay. Let him finish what he's saying. Go
But
ahead.
if you think of not only Africa, but North Korea, with this type of electricity generation, then North Korea could achieve the per capita energy of South Korea in a matter of a few years. And if you could do that in North Korea, think of the whole continent of Africa, where the amount of energy available to the average person in Africa is 10 watts per person. Think of that. Now, you in the United States have almost 2,000 watts available just per person. So how can you bring an entire continent to the level of the US or Europe or South Korea or China? Well, you can build thousands of coal-fired plants, and coal had its function in the day. But you get more radiation from coal production because there's uranium in the coal deposits than you get from any nuclear reactor.
Excuse me, is that coal, okay, I know about the coal, and what does that do for the environment and for the soil and what we ingest?
Right.
Like, don't they have that coal miners disease when they had that black lung disease
Right,
in
right.
Pennsylvania and all of
Yeah, that's why China is working on this fusion economy. Because while coal was necessary before we achieved nuclear fission, we could phase out the use of coal in producing electricity. We could use the coal as a raw materials resource to convert the coal into either liquid fuels or it's basically carbon. So we could turn it into diamonds if we want.
it.
But you're right. If you have the option of going away from coal, like the Chinese were building one coal plant per week just a few years ago. And that's why they had that heavy smog in the major cities. So to clean that up, you can't replace coal with windmills or solar arrays. But if you have nuclear fission and then fusion, you can eliminate the use of coal. And by the way, there was a report recently that said that there's so many million people who die every year from pollution. What they fail to say is that most of that pollution is indoor pollution.
Yeah.
And if you've been to, I was in India back over 30 years ago. And the thing that struck me was here was a nation that was they were building fighter jets, they were building advanced satellites. But if you go into a major city like Bangalore, you would see women taking the dung from water buffaloes, cows.
Yeah.
They don't kill the cows, but they use the manure. And they would make a little pancake and put it on the southward sun-facing side of the houses. Dry the dung, and the dung was a fuel that they used for cooking chicken or vegetables or curry
Inside the
in the house.
Yeah.
And if you look at in Africa, what the most women and children end up doing during most of the daylight hours, they're foraging for twigs to build a fire, and they're lugging water. Have you ever tried to carry 5 gallons of water? Water is heavy. And I'm not talking about the deuterium. But just lugging water and fire. And once you have the fire in the hut, the pollution, the indoor pollution, kills more people than the outdoor pollution. So if you can electrify the kitchens and you can electrify the water purification, because most of the young people, you look at countries like Senegal and some other countries where you have 1 out of 5 children die before the age of 5. And they die from diarrhea, cholera, simple diseases that we've eliminated. Yeah, waterborne diseases. So if you can have electrical driven water purification, electric ranges, you can electrify your transport and you can eliminate most of the pollution. And eventually with unlimited power, you can set up greenhouses in the Arctic or in Antarctica or on the moon.
There's also an interim use for magnetohydrodynamics that you mentioned before, which is using coal totally, that there's no pollution, as I understand it.
Right. Well, you have to heat the coal to high temperatures, so you turn it into a plasma. But it's better to use the magnetohydrodynamics with the helium-3, where you have, instead of a neutron, you have a proton, and you can use the products of the fusion directly to generate electricity.
Oh, I thought that you could do that with coal too.
Yeah, but it's not as efficient. Again, 1 kilogram of coal would give you the amount of energy if you took 1 kilogram of deuterium and helium-3, you get 1,000,000 times more energy than you get from coal or oil and gas. Now, coal, if you use magnetohydrodynamics, you could increase the output by a factor of, say, you could double it. So 2. With fusion, instead of doubling it, you increase it 6 by a factor of 6 or 1,000,000 times.
Where on this planet is coal still being grown, manufactured?
Or being mined.
Oh, yeah,
Well, the biggest place, to give you an idea, we used to use 1 billion metric tons of coal a year. It's about half that now. China uses 2 billion metric tons of coal a year. And it's still being used in Germany. The Germans, because of Fukushima, and by the way, to this date, 7+ years after the Fukushima accident, not one person has died from radiation. 18,000 people were killed by the tsunami. So what was the reaction in Germany? Said, well, we better shut down all our nuclear plants. And as this guy from South Africa in the EIR says that, well, the Germans could get away with shutting down their nuclear plants because when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, they import electricity from France. And France gets 75 to 80% of their power from nuclear fission. So coal is being used around the world. But the way to go to the next level, and you have to remember in history, coal was a big jump over wood. And some of these geniuses are saying, well, we want renewable energy, so we'll harvest trees, turn them into pellets, and put them in wood-burning stoves as a replacement for coal.
I got an idea. Why don't we harvest corn and turn it into alcohol and replace gasoline? How about that?
That's something you'd expect from the Obama's EPA. But unfortunately, we're still 40% of the corn harvest is going to ethanol.
You know, I saw something in school the other day or last week, and it was a little article on how to deal with this problem of hauling water and wood in Africa. And they made a big deal out of this guy who had invented what they call the solar cooker. Now, the solar cooker is nothing but a bunch of, but a couple pieces of wood or whatever your structural material is, covered with aluminum foil or something that reflects the sunlight, and set up at a certain angle so it would concentrate the thing. And then you put a pot inside a big plastic bag, and you heat it up, and that will heat up the water enough to make the water safe to drink, and it will also cook. It'll get up to about 250 degrees. And this is how you're going to solve the problem in Africa. People hauling water around. I mean, can you imagine kids thinking that that's what the future is about?
You see, if you can imagine if they were presented with what McGuire went through, instead of this and a lot of these scientists are still mouth this climate change nonsense. But if kids were presented with the basics of fusion, fission, chemistry, the periodic table in 5th grade. See, I remember in 5th grade, in my science class, I actually built a little clay bottle nuclear reactor, but I couldn't get the yellow cake, so.
You kept eating it, right?
But this was right after the moon landing.
Yeah.
So kids were looking forward to advances in science, and now we've gone backwards with windmills and solar power. The problem with solar, it's great. I have a calculator from 35 years ago. I've never changed the battery because it's solar. It has a little solar panel on the display. Problem is it doesn't talk, so I don't use it much. But that solar calculator is great. So for some low energy uses, like some remote cell tower somewhere, sure, use batteries and solar power. But to run a modern economy with a population density, you need high energy density fuels like either uranium or eventually fusion.
Joel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just speak up.
Okay, I was just reflecting on what this guy was saying during the video about the fact that the Atoms for Peace, the fission era didn't really work, which is a naive, we know is a totally naive thing to say, because there was a reason it didn't work, because fission power was shut down by the neocons, because they said that this would produce nuclear bombs all over the world. It was suppressed, and it was suppressed politically and other scare stories in the United States and Germany, as we know. Okay, so we have said many times over the recent years that fusion was being politically suppressed because of a lack of research and development money, way below they did discuss studies. I remember Ben and Jason giving lectures on this. They did studies that said if you spend this much on fusion research, you will get fusion within so many years, and it's never been spent. So what's the difference now politically, economically, cultural, scientific optimism that has created this opportunity with these miniature fusion reaction idea and other things? What led to this breakthrough?
Well, that reminds me, I forgot to mention, you know why Trump is so upset on this deal with Iran?
Why?
Because he was against enriching Iranians.
Oh.
But seriously, you can, with fission, if you have the reprocessing capability, and this is why they're so freaked out about Iran enriching uranium, is that they say that, well, the way Israel developed the bomb, and by the way, the irony is that they never mentioned that Israel has 200, at least, nuclear weapons. And I'm sure some of them are thermonuclear weapons. And while the Second Amendment goes for individuals, why can't nations have a right to bear arms? But the problem with the fission was that given enough spent fuel, you can extract plutonium from the spent fuel and create a basic bomb. So that is a problem. But if nations, instead of looking at the other as a mortal enemy, if you look at the other as a potential collaborator, then that problem goes away. But the advantage of fusion is that no matter how much you try, that if there's an accident where electric power is lost to the fusion reactor, the reaction shuts down. And the products of the fusion are not inherently radioactive. The problem with fission is that when you break a large element like uranium-235, you do have a large number of smaller chunks of elements that are radioactive, which, by the way, we use for nuclear medicine. And again, in that article in the EIR, half of our medical isotopes come from South Africa, a small reactor, South Africa. So now you got to give this McGuire guy some slack, because he was born probably at the time of the SDI speech.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have the whole history.
Yeah.
And he balanced this climate change. Like you'll see most any scientist now will genuflect at the altar of climate change. But if people were really serious about climate change, then this would be the solution. So fusion is inherently more energy dense. There are less reaction products that can be used for something else. More energy density, it's a higher platform.
Isn't fusion's excess that gives off is H2O?
No,
No?
no. Again, when you fuse deuterium and tritium, there's no oxygen. No H2, but there's no O. So you get the products are a helium-4 or alpha particle, and either a neutron or a proton. I put the wrong finger up. I'm not insulting. So the products of fusion is helium-4, which is a helium gas. So there'd be no more shortage of helium for laughing gas or balloons. And you can produce, with that high energy neutron, you can produce additional elements. You can desalinate, again, I forgot to mention, you can use these type of reactors to desalinate seawater, extract deuterium for the fuel, and extract the salt and have fresh, clean, potable water. So you don't produce H2O directly, but you can desalinate.
So they do it in Israel, use the seawater and take the salt out of that and use it in Israel.
Israel?
Israel uses gas, natural. The two places where you have most desalination are Israel, and they, I think about half of their drinking water is from desalination. And what they use natural gas as their power, and you have seawater and you push it through a membrane, and the salt can't fit through the membrane. So salt stays on one side and the clean water goes on the other side. But it takes a huge amount of energy.
Yeah, and big pumps to take the water out and reduce. They have
Oh yeah,
Get out of the ocean.
a lot of big.
right. And in Saudi Arabia, they have all this natural gas and fuel, and they literally burn some of their fuel to desalinate water. But if you have nuclear power, either fission or fusion, then you don't have any more limits to energy. So you can desalinate. And the funny thing is, you have California with an 800-mile coastline with the Pacific Ocean, and you have Jerry Brown facing the cameras, and the ocean is in the back. We have a water shortage. And water, you don't destroy water. When you use water, you usually excrete it. So it doesn't stay unless you're retaining water. Water flows through your body. So it eventually ends up back in the ocean. And the sun desalinates water into clouds, and we get rain. So the water is a cycle. Instead of depending on the sun, we can help the sun out by building desalination plants on the coast, including the Gulf Coast, so that we would never have a drought. And again, in South Africa, there's a shortage of water in Cape Town. But the South African we interview, the head of their atomic program, goes through, we can pump gas and oil all over. We can do the same thing with water, but if we desalinate water on the coast, we can send the water inland through pipelines. So we can eliminate any problem with droughts.
But we first gotta clean the water. I was just looking at something on CBS, Good Morning CBS on Sunday, and they showed like in Michigan where the lake was just saturated with plastic bottles and stuff. It was a whole, it looked like a planet. It was just floating in the water. The water is so contaminated, and it's a beautiful place. Michigan is very big. But
right.
The water is terrible. You know, you're scared to drink or even swim in it. You know,
you see, where does most of that plastic come from?
Bottles, water bottles.
Water bottles.
No, I'm serious. They should.
Right.
It's ironic.
That's
Yeah,
true.
it's very ironic.
So if we were to upgrade our water treatment plants,
Yeah.
we don't have to be carrying water bottles around.
No,
We can have, New York City is the most beautiful gravity-driven water system, but it takes water from the north of the state, upstate, and it feeds 7 million, 8 million people a day with hardly any treatment. But if we were to provide the power for water treatment plants, then we could eliminate most of these plastic bottles. And by the way, with a fusion torch, most of that plastic is made from petroleum, hydrocarbons. So if you want to eliminate plastic waste, you put it in the fusion torch and you get carbon and hydrogen and oxygen as your product. So we can eliminate the plastic waste with the fusion reactor.
Stronger recycle laws.
Well, the problem with just individual recycling, it's like the problem with individual self-driving cars. And Paul Gallagher made this point. If you were to replace all the cars in New York City, fire all the Uber drivers with self-driving cars, and I'm still waiting for my self-driving car so I can replace John Jammer. Sorry, Johnny. But if you were to replace all those drivers with self-driving cars, your speed limit would still be 5 miles an hour because you can only squeeze so many cars in a square mile of street. But if you have high-speed subways and trains, you can move thousands of people in the same square meter or square foot as you can with just individual cars. So the idea of individually sorting your bananas and bottles, and if you could just take that whole garbage bag and throw it in the plasma torch, the magnetic fields will separate. They'll do the separating. So instead of having these trucks take all this garbage and put it in a landfill, you could have the trucks go to the fusion plant, and with the fusion torch, that garbage becomes a natural resource without each little person taking out the water bottles and the caps and the plastic forks with food on it.
And the black garbage. Aluminum over here and plastic over there.
Aluminium.
You're right, aluminum.
Okay.
All right, Joel.
So
Thank you so much.
We've all been enriched.
make sure you get a copy.
Yeah.
You can get a PDF file.